We will continue here to discuss about the national efforts of EU member states in terms of migration. So far, EU policies sometimes were reactive, sometimes were proactive. The measures sometimes were or are systemic or systematic. Sometimes they could be considered as ad hoc measures. On the other side, the EU member efforts could be characterized by individualism, for instance, following national interests or peculiarities. They are very specific, sometimes they are very narrow because represent only the interests of one EU member state. Sometimes these efforts are very politicized in certain EU countries. But on the other hand, we have the principle of solidarity that is present here in EU primary law. Today's panelists would come with their research results, and we'll see to what extent. So it is possible to reconcile solidarity with national interests in terms of migration. For that reason, we have a couple of very peculiar, specific approaches, coming from Italy, or the vision, the Italian vision, let's say, a Greek one, Romanian contribution to migration, and the Visegrad group approach to it. Having said these things, let me offer the word to our first panelist, Dr. Anna Visvisi, who is a Jean Monnet professor at the American College of Greece in Athens. She is a political scientist, economist, editor, research consultant, with extensive experience in academia and think tanks in Europe and the United States of America. Her areas of interest, of expertise, refer to political economy of the European integration, including the crisis in Greece, politics, economy, security, especially of the Visegrad countries, global safety, security, including transatlantic relations, and obviously the theoretical dimensions of these issues. Anna, please.
Professor Cucerescu, thank you very much for this introduction. I simply blushed. But thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me here. It's my pleasure to be presenting at this conference and speaking basically on behalf of Greece and the Greeks, talking about migration. So this is the structure of my presentation, or a few points of introduction where I wanted to say just that what we've been discussing during this conference today anyways, that, well, the twin migration and refugee crisis that peaked in 2015-2016 basically revealed that Europe as a whole, not only the European Union, was largely unprepared to address the scope and the gravity of the situation that it had to face. And this basically led to a difficult situation where we also stopped talking to each other. And I'm leaving it here to your consideration, but my major concern is that also the researchers and then consequently also strategists and politicians somehow found themselves in a limbo, not necessarily knowing what to do. And here it is that several years after, I think the European Union is much closer to having an idea as to what to do and how to do it, and the presentations before attest to it, rather than we were back then in 2015, 2016. Greece, of course, represents in this context a very, very specific case because, well, all media coverage that you have seen, I'm sure, basically started from Greece. So you have seen the tragedy unfolding in front of our eyes in the Mediterranean, with the focus being directed on the islands. But of course, as I also happen to walk through Athens on a daily basis, I see how the situation looks like. how it looked like in the past, and I also see how things look in the countryside in Greece. So theoretically, as we'll be saying in a few slides ahead, well, Greece at the moment is there are about 73,000 migrants and or refugees in Greece. But of course, the unaccounted number of migrants/refugees, because their legal status frequently undetermined, is definitely much, much higher. So this is what we are going to do. So a few points we just said. Number two, querying so a few points on migration research, and I'm talking about a twofold bias and talking about the implications. Then we talk about the case of Greece, and then we try to make sense of the debate on migration in Greece and a few takeaways to leave some space for discussion later on. So the chair has been very explicit, 15 minutes, no more, and I'll try to make it. So two maybe controversial points on migration research. In my view, migration research, to be very specific, the most recent one, this one inflicted by the refugee and migration crisis of 2015-2016, reflects a double bias. One, what we've been writing about has been overly concerned with migrants, seen as an aggregate concept, which as a result led to a situation where we forgot about the individual and therefore the agency of the migrant, with the implication being that, of course, migrants as such were ontologically reduced to something like migration or whatever. But it also has very, very specific implications when it comes to policy making, because it essentially did not allow us to talk about the potential that every individual has, and therefore how a specific individual can contribute to the community that is arriving and joining. The second bias, I think, is about that the research on migration was preoccupied with the challenges that the incoming population faced. That is, the media coverage and so also the research would be always about what the migrants, what all migrants, again, as an aggregate concept, what they are going through. And it was done at the expense of the receiving population, in the sense that the concerns, fears, perceptions about them being in a situation of having to receive the incoming population, these remain topics that have hardly been discussed. And this has very serious implications, both in terms of research and in terms of policy making. So my point is, and this is point number two here, that basically an unspoken because, well, we hardly ever speak about it, an unspoken of tension has emerged, and this space has been used very efficiently by people who have aspirations to serve as demagogues or populists. And this is the key of the problem. So the good news is, of course, that as research on migration develops, we were able to address the first bias. So I see more and more research that addresses explicitly the question of agency of an individual migrant. So ontologically, there is like a very strong tendency not to make the mistake of reducing them ontologically. But I see a problem with regard to the next one. So theory versus praxis, it all resulted basically in populism, and this is the word cloud, and there's no need to discuss it. Everyone knows the cases of Italy, which Professor De Petris will be talking about. Everyone knows what's happening in Hungary, etc., etc. So the case of Greece. This is a picture taken on the island of Lesbos around 2015 or 16. So you have these three elderly ladies taking care of the infant, and the mother is there. This is probably one of the most symbolic pictures depicting of how migrants, how the individuals, how the human beings could be treated if we only wanted. This is the statistics. UNHCR, I took it today. So you can see that the peak of arrivals was in 2015-2016. But what is even more interesting is what you can see here is that, well, the numbers are not necessarily disappearing, or the tendency is actually reversing these days, where you can see that the number of arrivals in 2018 was 32,000 plus 18, so we have nearly 50,000 of arrivals just 2018, and in 2019 we've already had 7,000 of arrivals, and it's only the end of March. So something is happening. This is refugee and migrants in Greece, the official number. as I checked today. But this is, of course, the official statistics. So the question is, how many people have been unaccounted for? And we had this big discussion during the break. What's the methodology of accounting for those people? So as I travel across Greece, I see places, countryside, where you see like big communities of male workers from, I don't know where, because I don't really talk to them, but they play cricket or whatever else they play, and they are there alone and they are picking oranges. But I doubt it that they have any rights, they have any papers. So the question is, who employs them? What's their status? What's happening? How many of them are they? What are the conditions of living, etc., etc. And what about the receiving population? This is another story that no one talks about. Of course, we have had several achievements, and there is this program run by UNHCR, Estia, which comes from the Greek name, like the house fire. But the major point is that, well, even if we are able to cover these needs, there is still a great number of people that basically is like roaming around or is stuck in the refugee centers. This is how I prefer to call them rather than detention centers. So, which are the migration-inflicted challenges? Well, reception or detention centers. We know that they are overcrowded and the conditions of living are not always of the best kind, but it's like a big generalization because there are also very good examples, just that media, Western media, are kind of picky. The second one, unaccompanied minors, what we do with them. The problem is that because those young individuals do not want to be stuck in those detention centers, frequently they declare they are much older than they are, so that they can be let free. Which also creates other problems because then they have to taught as to how to behave in the open world, and it leads to a situation where, several situations which are difficult. Supervision, coordination, funding. Greece has received some support, but a lot of the funds that Greece receives is being basically given to non-governmental organizations, so more effort needs to be done in order to use the funds more effectively. Of course, there's the issue of pushbacks. These issues have been mentioned today. I'll be very happy to discuss it in greater detail, but this is not as innocent as it may seem. Greece cannot do simple pushbacks in the high seas because it will be about drowning people, so it's not in the cards. Even if there are allegedly some accounts of people being pushed back. If you push back someone who is in the high seas, these people will drown. So this then becomes a criminal offense. This is what is not happening. So another story. Alternatives to detention and integration, something that everyone is discussing, but have been no solutions yet. My favorite topic is cities and migration, because as you can realize, apart from the countryside, the majority of migrants, they basically stay in the cities. So the big question is how the city space, which is rather constrained, how it is able to absorb all those people arriving, and what kind of challenges this creates, both for migrants and for people already inhabiting the city space. And new arrivals dynamics, and I have data from the Greek police. What is interesting about this slide, which is in Greek, is that we essentially see that there has been a diversion of the points through which migrants arrive to Greece. So rather than using the sea, which has been so monitored, so carefully monitored these days, we see that there is an increase in numbers as, let's say this one. It's through the Greek-Turkish border. So there's a significant increase, and it's just about the 6 months of 2018. And overall, the tendency is increasing. So there is a big question in relation to, and I think the question was posed today, about the deal with Turkey. And the interesting thing is, of course, Greece was not part of this deal. So instrumentalization of migration, which will be the case in Hungary, to use a neutral example, and not really. So as I was looking for pictures, I found this one. I said, oh, I found something. But actually, this picture was found in a newspaper, a local, tiny newspaper, and it depicts the situation from 2011. So also in 2011, the migrants were there, and some people were commenting on it. Yes, they were living in these unhuman conditions, and they were working illegally, but the situation is not new. These days, you can't find these kind of pictures in the media. This is what I found in the media today. So you basically see accounts of migration only in terms of fears of migrants suffering from TB, or migrants having to be given access to schools and so on. So basically, the issue of migration has become a highly technical issue that is being discussed in Greece only in context of Greece's duties and obligations and other issues that Greece has to fulfill in the framework of other regulatory obligations that Greece has. So how do we make sense of all this? particularly that we know that in other countries where migration is such a big issue. So there's several points that I would like to make. So throughout history, ancient or modern, Greece has been exposed to migration. So migration is basically in the DNA of the Greeks. There were several waves of migration that the Greek society has experienced, starting the Great War of 1919 to 1922, and you see the numbers. So we have 2 million in early 20th century, you have 500,000 later, you have 1 million of Greeks who migrated in the 70s, and then you have basically another 500,000 of Greeks who left the country quite recently. So it just speaks to the fact that, well, the Greeks are kind of empathic. And these are the drivers of migration populism nexus. So if we look at this, you can have an idea. I won't elaborate on it. I want to keep my time limit. But there are several factors that contribute to the question as to whether migration will be used instrumentally or not, or whether the vicious cycle of hate, and populism will be triggered. And in the case of Greece, regardless of the circumstances, for some reasons we were able to tame it. So what are the major reasons that I would see? The amount of tragedy that the Greeks were exposed to basically does not allow, just on a very human basis, does not allow for a haphazard treatment of migrants. You cannot just play with human suffering, particularly when you see it with your bare eyes. As simple as that. Number two, because of the sheer size of migration and Greece being unable to tame it, if you have 3,000 islands and a sea border that is unpatrollable, you can't simply say, oh no, we just don't like it, we just can't. You just can't. You just have to get your boat and help them. That's the end of the story. So this is why it's an unavoidable phenomenon, whether you like it or not. Now what about the politicians? Well, in the 2015-2016, when the Syriza government didn't quite know what to do, and there was even one minister who, when asked about the migrants in the city center, she said, oh, they're just taking sun bath. And people were kind of thinking, so what they do, and other politicians wanted to pinch Syriza government on this account. Basically, everyone stopped. And implicit consensus emerged on the Greek political scene that you just don't. So today, as things are, no politician who respects himself or herself would dare to utter a word that would allow him to use migration instrumentally. There was a party that wanted to do it, the Golden Dawn. Basically, they were contained, and if they ever do anything against migrants, you will not read about it, you will not hear about it in the media. As simple as that. Which leads us to another point, is that the media has actually taken the lead. So the implicit consensus that has emerged for several reasons among politicians has been also consolidated by the media. This is why also, if you find anything that might be more specific about migration, about some problems that the Western media might have talked about, in the mainstream media in Greece, you won't hear about it. So, for instance, as I was preparing this presentation, I found an issue allegedly related to the situation on the river Evros, which is exactly on the Turkish-Greek border. The point was that allegedly were 35 migrants stranded and living in inhumane situation. And there was a detailed account of this story in Spanish and in German media, accusing the Greek government for doing this, and that. So I really had to dig into local press in Greek to find what was happening. And I found, yes, indeed, there were 35 people who passed the river, and the river is rather broad, and it's difficult to pass through depending on how much water there is. And yes, those people, they just were sitting somewhere there next to a fence that is there, and end of story. So they were rescued, and they were let in, and that's it. Because there are laws that the Greek government obeys. Takeaways. So what I would say is that in order to explain the phenomenon of Greek non-instrumental use of migration is related to Greece's history and overall mentality, where the past and the present intertwine very much, whereby the experience of migration is very much part of the Greek perception of the world. And then it's a very important part that the politicians played in triggering or concerting the consensus that you do not use migration instrumentally. And the third issue is, and maybe we could discuss it as well, is that in several respects, Greece just couldn't afford acting differently. And all this put together leads to a situation which is different from what we have seen elsewhere. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Now let me introduce the next panelist, who is professor at Giustino Fortunato Telematic University, in Benevento, Italy, and Tuscia University at the Immigration Academy. His areas of expertise are human rights, constitutional law, EU law. Professor Andrea De Petris, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, and of course, I have to thank the organizer of this meeting. If I just can take a few seconds for a very short remark, if there is one thing that Europe can do nowadays is something like this, bringing people together from different countries with different funds from Poland, Germany, and European Union, trying to discuss and analyze together matters which are affecting probably the future of Europe for the next years. So I'm very thankful to be here and try to contribute with a very short presentation to this debate. My topic, as you can see, is try to provide a very short analysis of what is the new provision, legal provision of regulation of migration in Italy. I have to be very quick, so I cannot go into the details. That's why I try to share my paper with at least the other members of this panel, but I think that there will be a chance to publish the contribution afterwards, so I hope that this could help the debate afterwards. I also decided to call this presentation, as you can see, Pursuing Public Insecurity, ? The reason is that this new decree, which is not officially a law, it became a law afterwards, but it was a decree in the beginning, was called Immigration and Safety by the authors, which means the new government that started this work on last June. The message, of course, was that there was a need for a new legal regulation of migration in order to increase safety, public safety. My point is that probably the real goal, the real end of the new provision is actually to increase unsafety. But this is my conclusion, let's say, so I don't want to anticipate it. So let me first describe what are the main points of the new legal decree. These are the main parts of my presentation, as I say. If we can discuss if this new provision is really a new approach to an old matter, which since Italy has been struggling with migration, I don't like the word migration crisis, so I don't use it, because it's not a crisis and it's not an emergency anymore. Italy is dealing with migration, has been dealing for the last 10 years, maybe 15 years, so you cannot call it an emergency anymore. Second point, I try to describe very quickly, as I said, the main contents of the decree. I try to point out which are all the critical matters of the single measures into the decree, and finally, I try to describe this conclusion, if really this legal provision is achieving what he's saying he wants to achieve. First, this is some very short presentation of the data, of the numbers, right? This is the numbers, as we have seen, is a very common trend in Europe nowadays. The number of the people coming to Europe, to Italian shores in the last months has been drastically reduced, which means one more reason not to call this an emergency. Right. We didn't have an emergency before, and we definitely do not have an emergency nowadays, as you can see. So there is one more reason to make this new decree actually unnecessary in this way. And this is a very graphical description of the so-called reception system, which I cannot describe in details. Just let me know that you should have a kind of two tiers, two elements of this system. The one made by the first reception facilities, which are called reception centers for asylum applicants, reception centers, and extraordinary reception centers. And the second part, which was supposed to be the project led by the System for Protection of Asylum Seekers and Refugees, SPRAR. This system was actually, in theory, very well constructed, because it was the idea was that the people should come into the first reception and then proceed to the next phase, to the next step, which was the second level of reception, where integration was supposed to take place. The point is that, unfortunately, SPRAR projects are still a minority into the whole reception system, and which means that the real integration measures are still lacking implementation, and they are affecting, of course, the quality and quantity of integration for migrant population achieving Italy. So what does this new decree do? Firstly, as you can see, there are only provisions which are actually reducing the quality and quantity of protection in many ways. Firstly, it's abolishing the humanitarian protection, which is actually provided by most of European countries nowadays. And it was a sort of third form of protection for migrants which could not apply for asylum or for other forms of international protection. So it was a way to give protection to people which otherwise could not be integrated in any other form of protection. And today, now, this humanitarian protection chance is not provided anymore into the legal system of Italy. Second point, this was an extension of the detention time in so-called permanence for repatriation centers, which are special centers, not the ones we have seen before, which are made for people which are supposed to be repatriated afterwards. And this detention has been extended from 90 until 180 days, so that double so long time. And of course, we are talking of people which are not criminals. We are only talking of people which are supposed not to remain in Italy. So they're not, they don't have criminal elements on their papers or something, right? Third point, the decree reduced the funds for voluntary repatriation and increase the financing of forced repatriation. Then also in this way, the message is very clear. We want to have people away somehow. It doesn't matter how. And this is also quite controversial, because on the other side, we know by other figures that this repatriation is not working anyway. People, even if they are not into the legal system of Italy anymore, migrants remain in Italy, and the government has not implementing what is assuming it wants to do. Fourth point, revocation or denial of international protection, which means that now the list of possible crimes which can lead to the abolition of international protection, also for migrants which actually deserve it, has been extended. Not only that, is applying to people which are even still under suffering a process. So they haven't been convicted yet. So it's enough to be charged with some of these crimes for leading to the end of international protection, which is actually violating of the constitutional principle, which means that assuming you are innocent as long as you are not convicted, definitely convicted. The decree says that basically you can be expelled by Italy even if you are not be convicted, and if afterwards the process could demonstrate that you are innocent, you are entitled to come back. Fifth point, the Territorial Commission, which is the body in charge for interviewing and evaluating the legal condition of all migrants coming to Italy, so far had more time for investigating every single case according to international conventions. And now the procedure has been accelerated, which means the Commission has less time and must be much quicker in order to find out if the single migrant is entitled to receive any possible form of international protection, of course, depriving the quality of, let's say, of the protection and even the chance to come into contact with the acceptance center system of Italy in this way. The reception system has been also restricted. We have seen before, I was talking of the SPRAR system, which was the part of the system entitled to provide the integration measures. Well, now we have not only a reducing chances for integration programs, which means we're going to have less SPRAR centers, much more bigger centers like a CAS, a CARI, which are bigger structures, bigger facilities, with much less chance to bring people integrated into the local area where they are. Because once you have a center with 500 people, it's different things that you have to integrate small communities, small groups of migrants in local communities. And even on financial level, it has been reduced since before we have 35 euros per day for every migrant. Now this contribution has been reduced to 24, and a part of provisions of services cut is the ones which are going to affect the quality of integration, which means language program, teaching program, social assistance, healthcare assistance. Other point, exclusion from the register of asylum seekers, which means that the people as asylum seekers cannot be registered anymore into the official registers of the municipalities. This is quite controversial as well, because majors are basically in charge for informing the central institutions if they have illegal foreigners on their territory. But once you don't have this register anymore, the majors cannot inform the central institutions if they have illegal migrants on their territory. And to the end, the withdrawal of citizenship. This is also a very controversial point. The decree says that Italy can proceed to deprive people of citizenship if they gain the Italian citizenship afterwards, not by blood, but by other reasons. Which means you're going to have two categories of Italian citizens: the ones which got the citizen by blood, and the other ones which could even lose citizenship. And this is another provision which is quite clearly unconstitutional. And this is the first consequence of the decree right now. You can see that the numbers of new illegal citizens in the last months has been increasing a lot, which is the main critical point about this provision. This provision is going to increase the number of illegal citizens, illegal migrants on Italian soil. Even people which were joining some possible form of international protection are going to lose it afterwards, since humanitarian protection has been abolished. And once they're going to finish all the other possible forms of protection, they are going to remain in Italy, but in legal condition. And these people are not going back. They're going to stay, and they're going trying to remain in Italy and to live somehow, probably, in black work kind of situation, with no assistance, no healthcare system, no education anymore. So to conclude this part is that, my point is that this decree, as other legal provision in other countries, are actually doing exactly the contrary of what they are saying. They are not increasing public safety. They are creating reasons for public unsafety, because these people, when they remain here, they are probably also join. It's not sure, but it could be quite possible to join the small criminality, because they need to live somehow. And of course, this sort of small criminalization is going to increase the debate and support this approach, meaning that migrants are dangerous for the public local community, so we have to increase the restrictive measures against it. It's a sort of very unpositive chain, which is kind of demonstrating itself by describing the phenomenon in this way. To conclude, I'd like to thank you for the attention and to conclude with this picture, which is taken by a Greek photographer, Yannis Berakis, which has been, he was a Pulitzer Prize winner in the past, and he's been taking photographs of the, phenomenon of migration in the last years, and he died early in March, a couple of weeks ago, on cancer, and I wanted to leave the contribution with this picture of him because I found very significant. Thank you.
Our next panelist is lecturer at the University of Oradea, the Department of International Relations and European Studies, also a member of the Institute for Euro-Regional Studies, also works for Eurolimes in Oradea. Her areas of expertise are border and migration studies, security, conflict analysis, and in general international relations. Dr. Edina Lila-Mesaros, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kucherescu. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to be here. Marta, thank you for your kind invitation. And this presentation is also a challenge for me because, though being from Romania, this is the first time that I'm actually presenting something about my country and how it dealt with the so-called migration stalemate. Let me tell you that it was an arduous task because of a lack of information, because of a lack of articles and a lack of serious research in this topic. So I hope that I will give you some very interesting insight into how my country dealt with this phenomenon. And as you see, also in the title of my presentation is a question that I also address to you as an open question. At the end of my presentation, you can also try to assess with me whether my country is a country for refugees or not. Before doing so, I want to present to you the situational picture of Romania. I mean, before this, the inflow of third country nationals, to be honest, Romania has never been a destination country. And nobody really chose Romania, for example, if they were coming from different countries. So, in general, we can say that Romania was mainly a transit country and not a destination country. If you need actually statistics from the beginning, from the beginning of the regime change from 1990s until 2014, 2015, around 4,000 people asked for asylum. So we're speaking about a low number of BIPs or beneficiaries of international protection. If you know about my country's history, you already know that it has never been a colonial country or an expansionist country, and it was locked down during the Iron Curtain, so it did not have the chance to get familiar and to be a multicultural society from that perspective. Well, being acquainted with new refugees under the mandatory relocation scheme, Romania was able to take in 6,351 refugees. So we'll see that if actually we're going to manage. I would not want to bore you with the methodological part. If we're going to elaborate an article, you're going to read about it. What is the main objective of my presentation? Is to evaluate the role played by my country in this entire stalemate and to objectively evaluate the possibility of integrating third country nationals into the Romanian society. So as methodology, I'm going to use the process tracing and mostly qualitative and quantitative analyses. Quantitative analyses of polls and surveys related to the attitude of my citizens towards this phenomenon and towards refugees, and again, qualitative document analyzes media content and discourse analysis of various personalities. So I have identified actually 4 challenges, which could be hurdles in front of a successful information. First of all, I told you that the trend is nobody really wanted to come to Romania. So it was mostly a transit country, not a destination country. One paradoxical situation in case of Romania that is mostly known in Europe as a country of emigrants. Probably you have heard about the exodus of Romanians. And actually, at the level of the European Union, we are the holders of a negative record, because according to the statistics from last year, Romania is the first at the number of foreign citizens who actually live in other EU member states. We're speaking about approximately 5 million Romanian citizens that reside in other EU member states. It's a huge number. So it's Romania a country of emigrants or immigrants? Again, when it comes to successful integration of migrants, we find administrative, financial, and logistical problems. We need investments and proper governmental initiatives. And to be honest, before the migration stalemate in 2015, migration, it was not even on the national agenda. Again, for successful integration, we have other obstacles as well. For example, the mentality of the people. If you would ask not necessarily young people of myself, but people of the age of my parents, they have an aversion towards refugees. Many of them, they believe that they are terrorists, they are going to blow themselves or to make suicide attacks. So actually they are presented as a security threat. There are stereotypes. Again, the media plays a very important role in depicting migrants. And I want to underline the role of NGOs and the role of civil society, who play a pivotal, central role in the integration process, a positive one. So the attitudes, general in the average Romanian people and the Romanian society is actually a negative one. They don't want refugees. So we're also speaking about the social construction of the other. So how is the other, how is the refugee or the third country nationals being depicted? As I've told you, my country is a country of immigrants, and in many newspapers you can speak about the Romanian exodus. The second picture, you can see there on the map the average number of persons who left the country on the 8 regions that we have in Romania in 2017. So actually the region where I come from is the one with 9.4, is the northwestern part of Romania. It's one of the most developed regions of all. But if we speak about the eastern part, for example, the Moldovan part, you can see that the average number of people, 70.7% of the people that now they have left from the region. This means that 1 in every 5th Romanian citizen who is physically able or fit to work, they live abroad now. And actually you can see there in order the countries in which the Romanian citizens reside. The most of them, they live in Italy and Spain, also in Germany, UK, and the USA. Okay, the situation management and the modus operandi, I made a timeline. Actually, what I wanted you to see that at the beginning of the migration stalemate in 2015, together with Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia, my country was one of the 4 countries that we have voted against the mandatory relocation mechanism. Initially, we're about to take in 1,785 refugees. But overnight, this number increased to a bit more than 4,000. So nowadays, we are about to take in 6,351. Okay, because I do not have much time, I wanted to see that the attitudes towards the refugees. I've analyzed a lot of polls. I would like to emphasize that one of the most accurate data is being represented by the Romanian National Institute for Statistics. I've compared the data for 2015 and 2016, and in 2016 you can see that almost 85% of the respondents declared that they do not want migrants or refugees in Romania. So this is the general opinion. The other polls, they mostly address the same. One positive thing, that at the level of my country in 2015, we have developed, or they have been developed, a national strategy on migration, and I would like to underline the motto. So at the level of leadership, presidential administration and government, migration is a process that needs to be properly managed, not a problem that needs solving. So this is the official position that my government has. Again, there are statistics, whether you have heard about the migration crisis, what people told, this is computer-assisted telephoned interviews, what people believe that, what are the main reasons, what are the main causes that actually made people leave, the governments of their countries of origin, ISIS, US interventions, and even if they were asked whether they believe that Romania is fit to manage, well, actually, the vast majority of the citizens, they don't really trust in their own country, saying that our country is not prepared in order to integrate. According to these statistics, it's very interesting because they trust more the army and the gendarmerie and the intelligence services than, for example, the border police in managing the situation. Again, whether the EU is prepared in order to face the migrant crisis, there is a partial accord with 39%, but partial disagreement with 22%. So actually, the trust in the European Union is not that much either. How the refugee crisis was framed in the media, these were the three major themes: sensation. So the vast majority of the articles that have treated the subject from the perspective of responsibility. I mean, it was a shock that Romania has to take in the mandatory quota, and after it, other articles spoke about violent incidents or the need to integrate and who is responsible. I do not have time for it. Again, the hate speech. So I've been told that I have around 3 minutes. So I've made an analysis. Our government, our country publishes on a yearly basis the hate speech report, and I've analyzed how people were related to the refugee crisis. Let me tell you that compared to other countries like Poland, Germany, it was not a big issue. I would like to emphasize that actually my former president, I'm not really proud of it. He's totally against refugees, against taking in refugees and migrants, and these are his statements, and this is actually the 3D maquette of the mosque that it's about to be built in Bucharest. So he does not want refugees, and he even said in a formal discourse that if he was president, he would have never accepted the mandatory relocation quota. But as I've told you, he's our former president, so at the level of leadership, there's a positive attitude that this needs to be solving. Again, the number of asylum applications for you to see that at the level of Romania is not that big compared to the EU average. But to Romanian realities, compared how many people came before 2014 is a big thing. And these are the three main asylum applicants, as you see: Syrians, Pakistanis, Iraqis, also Afghans. This is the last data according to Eurostat. I also want to underline that in a national legislation, in national documents, the number do not coincide with that of Eurostat. In national documents, for example, for 2017, more people came. And this, I will finish it. So it's Google Maps, and I've pinpointed myself for you the 6 regional centers that we have in Romania for the accommodation of refugees and of people needing international protection. I also put there the number of beds, the number of places that actually are. Altogether, there are 900 places in normal conditions, but in emergency situations, they can augment the places by 262. So actually, the one in up here it is next to Baia Mare și Concuța Mare, and I come from Oradea. Here are in Drădăuți, Timișoara, Giurgiu, Bucharest, and Galați. So we have the 6 centers. And now they're planning, in order to augment the number of places in Crevedia, they're making another one. Positive examples of integration. I do not know that I have time for it. I'm sorry, there were some good practices that I wanted to show that at the level of my country, they have a lot of programs which try to integrate them. And I will finish with this one. This is my own assessment, because I've told you that the main objective of my presentation is to make an assessment whether we can speak about a successful integration. I mean, in my opinion, this is a twofold situation. This is a real challenge, but I believe that on the long run, my government and my country can overcome it. So the pro-arguments that at least at the level of leadership, there's a positive mindset, both at the level of the government and presidential administration. So at the level of political declarations, we cannot find such negative attitudes as, for example, in finding case of Hungary. There's a willingness to try to manage the situation, to uphold the commitments to the quota, but the negative arguments that we find a lot of logistical, financial, administrative hurdles, and especially the socioeconomic conditions that are in my country. So the level of services offered to asylum seekers is rather precarious. Romania is more of a transit country. I told you it's a country of immigrants. We're not a Schengen. The mentality of the population, people are afraid. We are stereotyped, and the problem of coexistence. I would like to finish with this sentence. I believe that for Romania, admitting a greater number of refugees seeking protection would be a long-term chance to compensate for the deficits that have arisen over the past 15 years through massive labor migration to Western Europe. Thank you.
Much. Our next panelist is a PhD candidate at the Department of International Relations and Foreign Policy, the Institute of Political Science, Heidelberg University in Germany. Her areas of expertise are human rights, comparative politics, and foreign policy. So, Ms. Martina Vetrovkova, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you also to Marta for inviting me to this conference and for being able to present my research in front of you. I hope you're not too sleepy after the lunch, so I hope I'll spark it up a little bit. So good afternoon again. The title of my today's presentation is All for One, One for All, the EU, the V4, the different understandings of solidarity and migration. We talk about solidarity a lot, and another thing that we talked today or we discussed today was that we shouldn't call it a migration and refugee crisis. Well, you'll probably hear from me that I'll sometimes call it a migration and refugee crisis, but I mean it a bit differently. What I'll be talking about is the crisis of solidarity that we were experiencing in the past year. So this is how I understand the crisis mechanism. I've divided my presentation into 4 parts. At first, I'll talk very briefly about the migration-refugee situation crisis in Europe. I won't go too much into detail because you're all experts on this, but what I want to show there are the main division lines that have been emerging in the past few years, and also the crisis of solidarity, as I've just mentioned. Then I'll talk about the concept of solidarity from a more analytical point of view, talking about the different forms of solidarity in the EU, and then focusing specifically on migration and asylum in the EU. And then the main part of my presentation is focused on the reasons for the different understandings of solidarity, in order that we understand better why there are those kind of division lines, why are we talking about this east-west, north-south divide, and all those kind of things. And at the end, a brief outlook whether EU-wide solidarity is actually only a wishful thinking, or whether we can have something like this. The situation in 2015, when roughly 1 million migrants, refugees arrived in Europe, it challenged not only the response capacity of the individual countries, but also the unity and integrity of Europe or the EU as a whole. And since the exposure of the state was different, the reactions were also different. So while some countries accepted most of the asylum seekers, others erected fences and refused to participate in the EU-wide solution at all. So in addition to this kind of asymmetrical impact, there were also different reactions in terms of rhetoric, in terms of narratives, in terms of discourses. And although they were negative reactions and anti-migrant reactions visible all across Europe. We can't deny that. There were certain states where this was kind of even more pronounced, and most importantly, those discourses didn't come only from some right-wing populist nationalistic parties, but also from the very top leaders and across the political spectrum. And I'm talking about, of course, the Visegrad states, but again, not only. Those are only some of the quotes. I don't even want to read them. You can find them on the internet, and it's, from my point of view, it's horrible. If I don't talk about solidarity on the grassroots level or civil society level, because this is where we observed a lot of solidarity coming up, but more on the intergovernmental level, we can observe a clear crisis of solidarity among the member states. And while some countries, as for example the Visegrad states, were criticized for being non-solidary by not participating in the relocation system and by refusing to take people in, they, on the other hand, argued that they are in fact solidary because they are protecting the borders, and this is how they are solidary with the rest of Europe. We can discuss whether it's true or not, but here we already see that there are different understandings what solidarity is and what it means in practice. And also the whole issue was discussed from this kind of lenses of responsibility. So as you see on this quote by Viktor Orban, who said that the problem is not European, it's German, because he's not interested, or he doesn't care that the refugees are coming, because they want to go to Western Europe anyways. So let's talk about solidarity a little bit. Solidarity has become very clearly one of the buzzwords used a lot in the political language, but all scholars across all disciplines agree that the concept remains fuzzy, ambiguous, nebulous, not clear enough. And what are the reasons for that are on the one hand that the concept is very complex, and also related to that, it's hard to measure. Because if you have social constructed concepts like that, how can you measure that? How can you normatively decide what is solidarity and what's not? What are the consequences? The consequences are that the concept or the term is used in many different and sometimes even contradictory ways. And if you have an ambiguous understanding of what the concept should be, you cannot have a clear action. So what does result from solidarity? How should you act accordingly? It proved especially difficult to conceptualize the concept on the EU multi-level system, because you have different kinds of actors, you have individual actors, you have member states, and this is why I'm presenting this kind of framework that Anne Hughes and Michel Knopp came up with, where they combine the horizontal, the vertical level with the two actor categories, the individual, the collective actors, and came up with this typology of 4 different kinds of solidarity that we can see at the EU level. And as I've mentioned before, I'm less interested today in, say, the transnational solidarity on the individual level of grassroots and civil society actors, but more in the intergovernmental solidarity or solidarity between the member states. And if you look at the issue from a legal perspective, over the years there's been a gradual codification of solidarity in the EU law. Already the treaty constituting the European Coal and Steel Community acknowledged that Europe can be built, the Europe can be built only by concrete actions which create a real solidarity and by the establishment of common basis for economic development. And also the following treaties included the concept in their preambles, and the Treaty of Lisbon even expanded the concept by talking about solidarity in terms of solidarity between member states and between individual members. And this was also the case with regard to migration and asylum, where we have discussed this already in the morning. We have a clear, or we have clauses discussing solidarity, also within the Dublin regulation, we have a solidarity clause which calls for solidarity and burden sharing in the migration and asylum policy. However, all those legal concepts are also widely contested, which makes it, of course, harder to act when a crisis strikes. Coming up to the different understandings of solidarity and the reasons for that. I've identified several reasons that limit the solidarity on the EU intergovernmental level. One of them is that, from my point of view, the historical experiences still shape the national identities of states, which in turn, again, influence the policy and the decision-making and the understanding of concepts such as solidarity. And we see it when we look at the argumentation, the narratives, for example, with the responsibility argument, where some of the states argued that it's actually a Western European problem because they had the colonial past and they are therefore partly responsible for what's happening now. While they're without any colonies, why should they participate in the solution of the created problem? Another argument brought up very often was the problem with Germany, which refrained from sending refugees back in 2015, and it was welcomed by the EU as an act of solidarity that they suspended this kind of solidarity clause, but it was also criticized by others. And why? Coming back to my argument with this identity solidarity nexus, an example why, for example, the Visegrad states didn't like this German unilateral decision was because of their past, of their history, what I've mentioned before. So they still don't like when it's decided about them, without them, so they're still very attached to their sovereignty, and this is what they argued, that the mandatory quotas contradicts the European Council's principle on sovereign action, and they talk about dictate from Brussels, and as you know, then Slovakia and Hungary filed a lawsuit at the European Court of Justice. Related to this is the newcomers argument, where the states are sometimes arguing they're still feeling as second-class members, and it's again decided about them, without them. And one of the Visegrad politicians made this very clear when he said, "We don't like it when the policy is defined elsewhere, and then we are told to implement it." So it was again directed, especially at the German decision, but also at the quota. So it was not discussed properly with them, so that they wouldn't feel excluded or neglected. And the last argument, we've talked about this before, that they argued that they have no history of admitting refugees. We can discuss whether it's true or not, but this is the argumentation that we've had. Another factor limiting solidarity at the EU intergovernmental level is the understanding of reciprocity. There is a widespread notion that solidarity is a reciprocity-related concept, that states engage in solidarity acts because they believe in future reciprocity if they fulfill their commitments. However, what I argue is that some states understand solidarity differently, not directed towards the future, but towards the past. Helmut Thom speaks in this regard about the negative norms of reciprocity, where the states feel entitled to revenge on past wrongs. And apart from the Second World War and all this kind of history, even if you look at what the countries experienced during their transition period, where the restrictions in Western Europe regarding the labor market were raised, what they argued now was Western Europe was not solidary with us in the past. Why should we be now solidary with others? I'm not saying that this is what I represent, I'm just saying what the arguments were. Another argument or another limitations is that the states sometimes fail to understand solidarity cross-sectorally, meaning they require or demand solidarity in one policy issue or in one policy areas, while they deny solidarity in other policy areas. So this was the case with migration refugee crisis, where again some states, I think it was Slovakia and Poland as well, raised the issue with Nord Stream 2, where they didn't see the solidarity coming from Western Europe, and they say you are criticizing us, and at the same time you are also not solidary. Similar thing, our reaction came from Western Europe, arguing that those states are receiving millions of funding from the structural funds, but then when they are required to act solidary with others, they don't do so. And of course, we can't forget the political factors, the upcoming elections that played a huge role, that affect, of course, the decision-making, because the intergovernmental solidarity is, of course, overarching national solidarity, so we should be aware of this kind of interplay. And last but not least, some other factors, such as the proposal of flexible, effective solidarity. We could discuss whether a flexible solidarity is even possible, or whether solidarity should be understood as completely voluntary, or whether there should be some kind of rules as we have it in the EU law so far. So you see that there are so many different understandings what solidarity is. To summarize, was this crisis of solidarity a one-time thing? Well, I don't think so. It just pointed out to the existing problems that we already have. We heard this today morning. Professor Pane Bianco also asked whether this is a migration crisis or an EU crisis. And I would argue that we actually see the traces of an EU crisis. And we see that solidarity is one of the fundamental values and guiding principles in the EU, and since the Lisbon Treaty also one of the constitutional principles, but it has not been mirrored by corresponding practice. And the main reasons outlined here are what I've mentioned before, that there is a lack of commonality what solidarity means, and conflicting interpretations what it means to act solidarity in practice, that there is a prevalence of short-term domestic calculations without thinking about future reciprocity, and being stuck in the past. The failure to understand solidarity cross-sectorally, that we can't focus only on one issue and demand solidarity and then refuse to act solidarity in other policy areas, because they are all interrelated, of course. And then, as I've mentioned, divergence between future historical reciprocity. We should be aware of the different histories and the different national identities that we have to deal with in the European Union. Is it easy to solve? Well, definitely not. But I think that we should at least be aware of that. And as the quote says, refugees aren't the problem. Europe's identity crisis is. But at the same time, what we've heard from Maria Pomula from UNHCR today morning, who said, although the word solidarity has been overused sometimes, solidarity is the only way to move forward. So I would agree with that, and thank you for your attention.
Martina, and our last panelist, but not the least, is also a PhD candidate at the Institute of Political Science and Migration Research Unit, Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński University here in Warsaw. Mr. Piotr Szynawski, the floor is yours, please.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. My presentation will be focused on the approach of the Slovak Republic to contemporary migration challenges, from the migration crisis to the UN Global Compact for Migration. At the beginning, I would like to show you some figures on migration on the Slovak Republic and migration. As it is shown in these figures, actually more Slovak citizens are migrating from Slovakia than there are people migrating into Slovakia. Perhaps it is worth mentioning that Slovakia was a closed country prior to 1989, and it had very little contact with migration. It slowly started to open up after the revolution, but still people were migrating. It was a transit country, so the axis was migration from the east to the west. It has never been really a final destination for migrants. Here are some figures on asylum applications that were filed in the Slovak Republic in the last years. When we take a look at these figures, actually the numbers of asylum granted are relatively low, except for the year 2016. Which is the consequence of migration crisis, since the applications were filed in 2015 and decisions were made in 2016. Also, most of the applications were filed by the citizens of countries in the East, in Asia, and after 2014 also from Ukraine, which is also the consequence of the armed conflict. And also the last year, when it comes to international protection, the number was 37, which is also relatively low. Here I would like to show you the distribution of immigrants in the EU per 1,000 inhabitants, comparison 2015 and 2017. Slovakia is on the very bottom of these figures. Actually, there was 7.0 of immigrants per 1,000 inhabitants in 2015 and 7.2 in 2017, so which would be 0.7%. So it follows that the migration crisis has not had any real significant impact on the demography of the Slovak Republic. In 2011, the government issued a document which is titled "The Migration Policy of the Slovak Republic until 2020." It is rather a vague document which stated that migration may not be politicized. It formally declared the readiness to participate in harmonization of migration policies and the importance of legal regulation, migration, and keeping the obligations which were stemming from the membership of Slovakia in the European Union. For instance, it also promised to create the so-called Immigration and Naturalization Office in 2011. Now it's 2019, and there is no discussion on the creation of this authority. And it also declared the commitment to fight illegal migration through border protection and readmissions of illegal immigrants. When it comes to migration crisis and how the Slovak government reacted, here one quote by the Prime Minister at that time, Robert Fico, who said, "When I say something now, maybe it will seem strange, but I am sorry, Islam has no place in Slovakia. I do not wish there were tens of thousands of Muslims." So it was very much exaggerated. At that time, it was slowly it was a little bit before the parliamentary elections, which took place in March 2016. So most of the political parties tried to score points in the elections, and they were using the issue of migration to do so. Also, most of the parties refused the quotas. And Slovakia, together with Hungary, filed a lawsuit at the Court of Justice of the European Union. Later, Poland intervened in support of this lawsuit, but in 2017, the Court of Justice of the EU dismissed this lawsuit. Also, another step which Slovakia made was the so-called anti-terrorist law. They changed Article 17 of the Constitution on detainment. Before, a person could be detained only for 48 hours, but they introduced a 96 hours detainment for persons charged with a criminal offense of terrorism. However, the fact is that since the introduction of the new criminal code in 2005, only one single person has been charged with this criminal offense of terrorism. Also, they changed the law on religious communities. They raised the number of persons in order to make up a religious community from 20,000 to 50,000, which they also explained by the fear of creating Muslim communities. Actually, the number was around 5,000 Muslims in Slovakia. And they also, together with partners from Visegrad, they introduced the concept of flexible solidarity, so that they would themselves say how many asylum seekers they would accept. An example was Gabčíkovo, so they accepted 500 asylum seekers from Austria temporarily in the village of Gabčíkovo, and they introduced some governmental scholarship and also agreed to take 150 asylum seekers only purely of Christian religion in Slovakia. By the way, most of them left after a short time because they themselves said that they couldn't really bear the cultural difference. In 2017, new security strategy was introduced in Slovakia, which again depicted migration as a threat for stability of the European Union and functioning of the Schengen system, and it was also depicting possible infiltration of people attracted by radical and terrorist organizations into migrants and refugees waves, and it also stressed the specific importance of cooperation with other V4 partners. There was also discussion going on concerning UN Global Compact for Migration in November 2018 in Slovakia, which even led to demission of a foreign minister. At that time, Robert Fico was no longer prime minister. He was just a member of parliament, but he was still the chair of the ruling party. And his views, he expressed his views, I will quote, "In my opinion, this document is dangerous because it does not distinguish between legal and illegal migration and considers migration as a positive issue. It is supposed to be innovative, bring prosperity and sustainable development, but our experience with migration in Europe is different. This document does not correspond to migration policy of the Slovak Republic. The Global Compact is in strong contradiction with our national interests. Migration has brought terrorism to Europe. It endangers religious, cultural, and historical roots of Europe." And recently, there were presidential elections in Slovakia on the 16th of March. Here I just put on the left, it is Štefan Harabin. He was previously judge at the Supreme Court of the Slovak Republic. He was running in this presidential election. He ended up the third. And he was sharing many hoaxes on migration. I put one of them here that already in Slovakia there are 10,000 migrants, and this actually appeared on 14th of May 2018. So he was saying that by the 1st of July 2018, another 11,000 African migrants would be moved to Slovakia, and then that they would get 800 euros per month. They would get free accommodation and other benefits. However, he was also stating that citizens of Slovakia, they have pensions around 300 euros, and that minimum salary is 500 euros. So he was himself sharing such hoaxes, and also another candidate who ended up on the fourth place. Here I put the pictures of billboards that were in Slovakia saying "Stop immigrants," and immigrants are occupying Europe. What is very concerning, what I personally find very concerning, is that these two candidates representing far-right views, they got 25% of votes in these presidential elections, in my opinion, the reactions of the government to migration crisis and the political discourse in Slovakia, it only contributed to the rise of the far right. In few days, on Saturday, there will be second round of presidential elections in Slovakia. The two candidates are formally claiming that they are supporting European solutions and European views on migration issues. So let me just hope that that the new president will be consistent with the approaches on the European level. Thank you so much for your attention.
Very much for the insights here coming from EU member states, a couple of EU member states here from the Visegrad group, Greece, Italy and Romania. And now we'd like to pick up 2-3 questions, no more. I know it is quite difficult, but we have here to manage. Please. No questions? Okay, please.
I got one question. My name is Maciej Cesarz, University of Wrocław, and I've got one question to Professor Andrea de Petris. Thank you very much for this really interesting presentation. And my question is associated with the new policy of citizenship stripping, which is nowadays possible in Italy. And since in my research I compare these counter-terrorist measures which are already applied by a majority, in fact, of European states, but what is really striking that it's possible to deprive people of citizenship, of Italian citizenship, in case if they were naturalized in Italy and they have married Italian spouse. So, in fact, it limits the scope of this measure to people who are immigrants and who are children of immigrants. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But it is also possible to apply this policy to people who have only single citizenship, single Italian citizenship. So it means that if we deprive these people of citizenship, they will be rendered stateless. So only Britain has equally strict solutions which are applied. And my question is, do we have any knowledge about implementation of this policy? So is it really working in Italy? I know it's really short time because it's half a year when this law was implemented, but is it really practiced by the government? Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question. First let me say that, stress what I already said, this is quite possible that this part of the provision is going to be declared unconstitutional by the Italian Constitutional Court. It's only a matter of time. Some regions already brought the question in front of the Constitutional Court. The point is that it's going to take probably 1 year until the court will take a decision about that. But this is not the problem for actual governments, since this is a political matter. They want to show that they have a new trend in managing migration, and this is what they want to show till the end of May for the European elections. What happened afterwards doesn't matter. It's not on the political agenda. This is the real goal of such a measure. For your technical question, we can say this is quite similar to the example you brought, with one point, which is you cannot deprive an Italian citizen of his own Italian citizenship, whatever the way he achieved the citizenship, if he doesn't have another one. Right, so you cannot create a stateless people. This is against the Italian regulation. Is also against some international conventions that Italy also joined. So this is not allowed in any way. This is only this last chance that we've seen. It could be only possible if you have people which already are holding another citizenship. And basically losing the Italian ones are automatically, let's say, rejoining either first the previous one or remaining with the previous one they had before.
Thank you very much for all the panelists. And now we have yet passed to our next panel.
Thank you, Professor Vassil, and thank you, dear speakers. So it was a long session, but I believe full of up-to-date information concerning the migration and asylum situation and policies in different parts of Europe and in different EU member states.